My brother shot me out of jealousy. Have you ever been hurt by your own family? Not a stranger, not an outsider, but the person who taught you to ride a bike, who stood shielding you from the rain outside the school gate, who hugged you when you had nightmares. I am Claire Bennett, 34 years old, the youngest FBI director in history. But on one fateful night, as I was racing against time to rescue a senator's daughter, my brother pulled out a gun and pointed it straight at my face. And in that moment, I realized that the deepest wounds are not on the skin, but in the heart. That encounter not only slowed down a rescue mission, but also reignited all the simmering pain of decades. From meals filled with comparisons to parental expectations never openly stated. But this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a journey of two people who were once siblings, then became strangers, and then somehow learned how to listen, forgive, and move forward, even if not in the same direction. If you've ever felt that no matter how hard you tried, it wasn't enough in the eyes of your loved ones, if you've ever wished for just one moment of recognition instead of comparison, then this story is for you. And it all began right where all my wounds were formed. The old house with 3 people sitting around the dinner table, but no one truly listening to anyone. I was born into a family where law was not just a profession, but a way of life. My father was a police chief for 20 years, and my mother was a renowned prosecutor. Dinners at our house weren't about movies or summer vacations, but revolved around cases, investigations, and trials. In that house, my career was revered, and my brothers and my future paths seemed set from a very early age. Daniel is 5 years older than me. When I was little, I always saw him as a hero. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to tell if someone was lying, and even how to defend myself if someone bullied me at school. But as we grew older, the distance between us became more apparent. Daniel wasn't a good student. He struggled with every grade. Meanwhile, my report cards were hung on the refrigerator while he quietly tucked his into a desk drawer. I remember once my father put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Not everyone needed high grades to be good people." But I saw a fleeting, hard-to-hide sadness in Daniel's eyes. When he graduated from the police academy at 18, my father was so proud that he took the gun that had belonged to my grandfather and presented it to him. That was a Mitchell family tradition. At that time, I was 13 and had already started thinking about a different path. I still loved the law, but I didn't want to patrol the streets. I wanted to do more. I wanted to change the system from within. While Daniel began his career as a patrol officer in the very town we grew up in, I received an acceptance letter from Harvard at 17. 3 years later, I stepped foot into Harvard Law School. It wasn't a choice to compete. Simply, I knew where my abilities lay. I wasn't good at reading body language like Daniel. I didn't have his sharp street instincts, but I knew how to analyze, to question, and I understood the legal system as if it were a part of my blood. Daniel never said anything, but I sensed a change. Family meals became stifling. When I shared my first internship experiences at the Department of Justice, he would just stay silent, nodding vaguely. From a brother who once taught me all sorts of things, he now barely spoke to me. Then, the day I was recruited by the FBI, I brought the news home on a Sunday evening. Our family had just finished dinner when I told my parents I was about to start work in Washington. Daniel put his knife and fork down and smiled a strange smile. "The FBI, huh? Pretty fancy. Suits our family genius." My mother gently admonished him not to be sarcastic. I tried to keep my voice steady and said it was a job that suited my skills. But I knew. Everything had fractured. In our parents' eyes, we were both loved. But in Daniel's heart, perhaps he never felt that way. He worked hard in local law enforcement for 7 years without a promotion. Meanwhile, it took me less than 10 years to become deputy director of the FBI. The distance between us was no longer just a few grades or career choices. It was a prolonged silence, missed birthday wishes, and averted gazes at family gatherings. The night I announced my appointment as FBI director, officially becoming the youngest person in history to hold that position, Daniel stood up from the table, leaving his half-eaten plate behind, and said, "Congratulations. I hope that makes you happy." He closed the door so softly it was more chilling than a slam. 6 months later, I hadn't heard his voice again. Until that night, on a deserted stretch of Route 16, when the patrol car behind me flashed its lights and ordered me to pull over. I didn't know who would step out of the car. I only knew I was carrying the life of a 20-year-old girl in every racing second. And I never expected that the person who would stop me would be the very person who had protected me throughout my childhood. That night, there was no moon, only the long beams of headlights cutting through the empty road. I was driving an unmarked black SUV, heading towards the rendezvous point where the special ops team was ready to rescue the hostage. My mind was racing through response scenarios, building blueprints, and the remaining time before the girl would be moved. Everything was on schedule until I saw flashing red and blue lights behind me. Professional instinct told me to pull over, even though all I wanted to do was keep going. I rolled down the window, preparing to show my FBI badge. When the flashlight shone directly into my face, I kept my voice calm until I heard that voice. Papers and license. 1 second ago, I was the FBI director. The next second, I was Daniel's younger sister. I called his name, keeping my voice restrained. I'm in an emergency involving national security. But Daniel's eyes showed no sign of yielding. He flatly ordered me out of the car, told me to raise my hands, and then, an action I will never forget. He put his hand on his gun. I don't know exactly what moment made Daniel act like that. Was it because I dared to cross his boundaries? Because I became a symbol of success he could never achieve? Or because for all those years, no one in our family truly told him that he was good enough, worthy enough? I don't know. But that night, in the flashing lights of the police car, I realized the most painful thing. We were no longer siblings. We were two strangers in different uniforms, standing on opposite sides of the same pain. The incident didn't stop there. Daniel handcuffed me, disarmed me, and searched every confidential document in my car as if I were a suspect. Even with confirmation from communications channels, he still didn't stop. I was held in the patrol car for nearly 40 minutes. During that time, the special ops team waited for my command signal, while the hostage's life was counting down. That night, not only was the mission interrupted, a part of me also shattered. Not because I was humiliated, not because I was doubted, but because I realized that sometimes family members don't destroy us with malice, but with the pain they never dared to name. Daniel wasn't an enemy. He was a victim of expectations, of comparisons, and of years of prolonged silence that no one in the family dared to break. If you've ever experienced that feeling, the feeling of being treated as a stranger by your own family, if you've ever stood between honor and blood, between reason and emotion, please share in the comments. We will always listen to you. I pulled over to the side of Route 16, the tires grinding on the gravel with a harsh rasp. The silence at nearly midnight was strangely eerie. I intended to take less than 30 seconds to present my FBI badge and continue my journey. But when the flashlight shone directly into the car window and the officer's voice demanded my papers, my blood seemed to freeze in my veins. I knew that voice. Too well. It was Daniel. He didn't recognize my car, but when the light hit my face, I saw a brief moment of confusion in his eyes. Then it was replaced by a cold gaze I had never seen before. I tried to stay calm, explaining the emergency involving a senator's daughter. But Daniel didn't back down. He said I was speeding and demanded to see my papers. I emphasized the classified nature of the mission, citing federal emergency procedures. He responded with a silence and a feigned professionalism that was cruelly indifferent. He refused to acknowledge my badge. When I reached for my phone to contact my subordinates, he ordered me to raise my hands and pointed his gun at me. The feeling of a gun aimed at my face wasn't new to me, in my line of work. But never from a family member. And never in this circumstance. I exited the vehicle as requested, hands up and unarmed, trying to keep my wits about me. I stated the kidnapped girl's name, and I said I carried nothing but my official duty and authority. But he still ordered me to face the car, then handcuffed me. Right then, I knew this had gone far beyond a routine traffic stop. Daniel didn't act like an officer. He acted like someone who had waited for years to gain control, even if only once. even if only over me. He pulled me back to the patrol car as if I were a criminal. I watched him open my trunk and pull out my secure phone, my service weapon, and even highly classified documents marked as restricted. I warned him not to look. He ignored me. Then he called for backup, describing me as an imposter, carrying weapons and suspicious papers. Throughout that time, my phone rang constantly. It was my team. It was my deputy. It was a distress signal from an operation teetering on the brink of failure. But Daniel brushed everything aside, until the police radio blared, announcing an ongoing FBI operation in the area. My name was broadcast, but he continued to search my car, pretending he hadn't heard. My patrol car was surrounded by 4 police vehicles, their red and blue lights spinning amidst the night forest. Officers stood around, awkwardly looking at me, handcuffed, held in the car, with confidential documents spread out on the hood like evidence. One of Daniel's acquaintances, Victor Chang, recognized me. He mumbled, "That's the FBI director. I saw her on CNN last month." But Daniel continued to follow procedure rigidly. When the last call came in, Daniel picked up my phone and saw Miles Porter, my deputy, on the screen. He didn't answer. He just looked and put it down as if he hadn't seen it. Those around him began to feel uneasy. One suggested calling to verify my identity. Daniel coldly replied, "If she's an imposter, you'll be responsible." In the car, I no longer felt angry. I felt tired and sad. Then my team's cars appeared. They couldn't get close because Daniel had blocked off the area. Next came the car of the regional police chief, Elliot Graves. When he arrived, he glanced at the patrol car, saw me inside, and exclaimed as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "My God, is that the director?" He immediately ordered the door opened. Daniel paused, but he roared, "Open it now." Daniel reluctantly pulled out the key. When I stepped out, he stood at attention, bowing, his voice filled with remorse. "Apologies, Director. This is a serious mistake." I didn't respond. I just looked at Daniel. His eyes were blank. His hands trembled slightly as he returned my phone, gun, and documents. I didn't say a word to him. I turned to Harris and requested an escort to the scene. The rescue plan was still waiting for my leadership. 3 days later, I sat before the oversight committee. They asked about the lost time. I simply said one sentence. There was an incident with local police. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't mention Daniel's name. I didn't describe it. I kept silent. And I knew that silence was the hardest choice I had ever made. Not because I was afraid of being seen as weak, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I understood that the truth is not always the way to heal. Sometimes, keeping a part of the pain to myself is the only way to prevent others from being hurt even more. 3 days after the rescue operation, I sat in the FBI conference room before the oversight committee. My shoulder still throbbed from the shrapnel wound, covered by a white bandage beneath my blazer. They asked me about the delay. They needed an explanation. I could have named Daniel. I could have recounted every one of his procedural errors, every time he ignored his superiors, every second he jeopardized a hostage's life. But I didn't. I simply said it was a coordination issue with local forces, and I took responsibility for the lost time. No names, no accusations. Not a single cut was sent his way. After the hearing, my assistant caught up with me in the hallway. Miles Porter looked at me, his eyes full of skepticism. "You just saved him from permanent expulsion." "Why?" I didn't answer immediately, because some answers can't be condensed into a few words. Some things only those who grew up in a family that constantly put expectations on the dinner table would understand. I didn't forgive Daniel. I just wasn't ready to completely kill a relationship that was already full of cracks. I was ordered to take a week of medical leave. I returned to my parents' house in Boston. The old wooden door creaked its familiar sound as I opened it. In the living room, the same old sofa where Daniel and I used to fight for a seat. My mother was making tea, her hands trembling as she listened to my account. My father remained silent for a long time. Neither of them could believe what Daniel had done. But I knew, deep down, they also understood the reasons. That evening, Daniel came. He stood right at the living room doorway, visibly thinner and unshaven, his eyes deeply sunken from lack of sleep. I didn't know if he dared to look me in the eye, but he finally did. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I nodded. A piece of shrapnel grazed my shoulder, nothing serious. He was silent. Then he whispered, almost too quietly to hear clearly, "I didn't mean for it to be like that. When I saw you, everything just exploded in my head." I didn't reply. I just looked at him. Because this was the first time after 6 months of silence, after years of unspoken rivalry, I saw a Daniel not in uniform, not carrying his pride. Just a tired man trying to understand himself. He said that after being suspended, he was required to see a counselor. At first, I didn't plan to say anything. But then I started talking about growing up, about the refrigerator only having your report cards, about the gun Dad gave me that made me feel like a failure. I realized I never hated you. I was just jealous that I wasn't as good as you. I sat still, my heart heavy. I never wanted to compete with him, but I also never knew he was in so much pain. Then he apologized. No drama, no tears, just a raw and honest statement. "I'm sorry, not just for that night, but for everything I never said directly to you." We didn't hug. There was no dramatic movie-like moment. But in that silence, I felt one thing. The person who had hurt me was also the person who had been hurting long before. And the healing journey, perhaps, had to begin from both sides. 2 days after my first conversation with Daniel since the Route 16 incident, I sat at our familiar family dining table, where hundreds of evenings had seen hot meals, the sound of my father recounting arrest stories, and my mother reminding me to bring a jacket. But this time was different. The atmosphere among the 4 of us was as thick as fog. Daniel sat opposite me. My mother poured tea, her hand still trembling slightly. My father said nothing, just mechanically dished out food. The meal began in silence. Each of us carried our sense of awkwardness. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "I'm waiting for the disciplinary decision. I might be transferred out of the unit, or worse, fired." His voice held no resentment, just the raw truth. My parents were silent. I knew they were trying to control their emotions. My mother clasped her hands together and said softly, "I never imagined things would come to this." Daniel didn't respond. I spoke, my voice even. "I didn't mention your name in the hearing." My mother looked up at me, full of gratitude. My father nodded slightly, but I didn't say it to receive appreciation. I just wanted everyone to understand that I was still choosing to preserve this family, even though there were times when my relatives hurt me the most. That meal ended with no one truly finishing their portion. But there was one thing I realized. For the first time in many years, we were no longer trying to be right. We were just trying to listen to each other. 6 months after the Route 16 incident, I was invited to speak at a conference on interagency cooperation between the FBI and local police. It was the first time I agreed to speak publicly after the incident. As I stepped onto the podium, I looked down at the audience and saw Daniel. He was sitting in the middle row wearing a new uniform without the detective name tag. His face was calm, not bowed, not evasive. I began my speech with a familiar sentence. The lines between law enforcement agencies are not always clear, but when we lose sight of our common goal, sometimes we become the barrier. The auditorium fell silent. I didn't mention the incident. I only spoke about the necessity of coordination and the potential consequences when we let personal emotions interfere with our professional duties. When I concluded with a call to see each other as teammates instead of opponents, I saw Daniel nod slightly. In his eyes, there was something like recognition, perhaps for the first time in decades. After the conference, he came up to me. No apology, no, "You were right." Just a light sentence, but enough to open a new door. "You spoke very well, and I guess from now on we should avoid arresting each other on the road." I laughed. A sigh of relief. Somehow we had found a new language, no longer the language of rivalry, but of two people learning to start over. We didn't become close siblings again like when we were little, but we started having coffee dates again and exchanging texts asking how each other was doing. That was also considered a big step forward in our less than close relationship. That evening, Daniel invited me to dinner with our parents. I accepted, not because I thought everything was fine, but because I wanted to try stepping into a new chapter with a lighter heart. The meal wasn't much different from previous times. Mom still cooked the lemon chicken that Daniel and I both liked. Dad told stories about catching a 3-pound fish all morning, but no one mentioned the Route 16 night, and no one needed to. Because what needed to be said, we had already said. And what remained unsaid, perhaps time should answer. After dinner, Daniel walked me to my car. We stood next to each other for a while, saying nothing. The moon peeked from behind the trees. The street was strangely quiet. Then Daniel spoke, his voice deep, but not sad. I'm thinking of transferring. Somewhere no one knows what happened. A different start. I was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Do you want to start over? Or are you just running away?" He smiled, half mocking himself. I'm not sure, but maybe you're right. It's not the place, but what's inside. We parted with an unspoken promise that even if we never returned to how we were, we wouldn't revert to the old cracks. We might not be close, but we understood. And sometimes understanding is enough to start anew. I drove away, my left shoulder still aching faintly when the weather changed. But in my heart, the heaviness had eased. Because I knew, from the moment Daniel pointed the gun that day, to the moment he bowed his head in apology in our parents' old room, we had both changed. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is when you understand that pain also has reasons. And sometimes that reason is the very person you love most once thought they weren't enough to be loved. 6 months after that terrifying night on Route 16, the wound on my shoulder had completely healed. Only a small scar remained beneath my shirt, enough to remind me how real everything had been. With the FBI, I signed off on a new protocol. Any officer involved in an emergency federal transport must be directly supported by a priority communication channel, a simple protocol, but one written by the 40 minutes I was handcuffed in a patrol car by my brother. As for Daniel, the punishment wasn't light. He was suspended for 3 months without pay, stripped of his detective rank, demoted to patrol officer. His reputation in the force was severely affected, but he still kept his job, partly because the union intervened, partly because I didn't press charges. We didn't go back to how things were. But we both started therapy, individually, and little by little, together. I learned to realize that my past silence also contributed to him feeling lost. Daniel learned to understand that he wasn't inferior to me, but just needed a different path that suited him better. We met once a month, usually at a small diner between my office and the neighborhood where he was on duty. At first, it was just coffee and silence. Then came a few small stories, then laughter, then genuinely caring questions, not out of obligation, not out of status. I know we're not the ideal type of siblings, but perhaps what we rebuilt is even more precious. It's an imperfect relationship, but a real one. Not binding, but connected enough not to turn our backs when one of us falls. I used to think family was something you had to hold on to at all costs. Now I understand that sometimes the right thing to do is to dare to let go of old expectations, so both can breathe, make mistakes, and then start over as two normal people. Not every relationship can return to how it once was. Some cracks cannot be erased by time, but they can still be mended with understanding, not for forgiveness, but for letting go of old roles. When we no longer try to be the right person, the best person, the most loved person, perhaps then we truly see the other not as an adversary, but as someone trying to survive amidst their pain. If you've ever had a relationship shatter due to prolonged silence, if you've ever stepped back out of love but couldn't put it into words, then you are not alone. Share your story in the comments. Who knows, what you've experienced might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to start anew. Not from the beginning, but from the very place where both were most hurt. If you liked my story, please subscribe to see more interesting stories.